Before I begin in Esther, I heard a story a couple days ago, and I wanted to share it. I think I've heard it before, and I know some of you probably heard it before, but I just wanted to share this. It has nothing to do with the message, but it really lifted my spirits. I'm going to start by reading Hebrews 1:14. In Hebrews 1:14 it says, "Are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for those who inherit salvation?" Talking about angels. And there's a story, true story, of a Dr. S.W. Mitchell, who was a Philadelphia neurologist. And he was fast asleep one night when he was awakened by someone knocking on his door. And opening the door, he found a little girl, poorly dressed and deeply upset. And she told him that her mother was very sick and asked the doctor if he would please come with her. Well, it was an extremely cold night in Philadelphia. It was snowing and everything else. And actually, Dr. Mitchell was bone tired, but he dressed and he followed the little girl. Now, Dr. Mitchell found the mother desperately ill with pneumonia. And after treating her with medical care, he complimented her on the intelligence and persistence of her little daughter. And the woman looked at him strangely and said, "My daughter died a month ago." And she added, "Her shoes and coat are still in the closet over there." Dr. Mitchell, being amazed and perplexed, went to the closet and opened the door. And there hung the very coat worn by the little girl who brought him to attend to her mother. And he thought to himself, he felt the coat, and it was warm and very dry. And Dr. Mitchell said she could not have been out in this cold weather, this snowy weather. And you know what that was? It was an angel. In the form, it was not the little girl, it was the angel in the form of the little girl taking the angels are here ministering to us. And I believe it was an angel in the form of the little girl, not only to bring help to the mother, but to give the mother comfort and encouragement of where her little daughter is. And I heard that story, and I've heard it before. And I thought maybe this Christmas I'll do a 4 to 6 week study on angels. But we're in Esther now, and Esther we're in chapter 2 of Esther. Chapter 2, and we're going to be looking at the rest of chapter 2. But I would like to start by reading verses 12 through 18. Please listen carefully, for this is God's word. Each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months' preparation according to the regulation for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation appointed: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the sancted house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called her by name. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Hegai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained the favor in sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in the sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. So one thing that jumps out at me looking at this is, remember chapter 1, you had what you would call the war banquet of 483 BC. And it's just magnifying the wealth of the king of Persia. His Greek name is Xerxes, his Hebrew name is Hashras. But Xerxes was displaying all his wealth, and he could do anything he wanted as king. Everybody was at the whim of the king in the empire, in the government. And so we get to chapter 2, and you see the same again. You see the extravagance, the indulgence of getting all these women ready to spend one night with the king. All the beauty preparations for 12 months. And I think to myself, didn't he learn anything? Because remember in chapter 1, you had, and I get a lot of this from Herodotus, is his name, who wrote the history of Persia. And in 483 BC, they were getting ready. Xerxes wanted to go against Greece again. His father Darius, who's in the Bible, he's the one that made the proclamation. Whoever wanted to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild Jerusalem was able to leave. That was Xerxes' father. And he was defeated by the Greeks. And so Xerxes wanted to get like vengeance. He wanted to go against Greece again. So he has this banquet, a 6-month banquet. And he invites all the leaders, all the military leaders, all the administrators, satraps, all of them from the 127 provinces to come and indulge themselves in the 6-month war banquet. And he was trying to show them that if you follow with me into war, this will be yours. I can give you as many rewards as you want. And so then he calls his queen, Vashti, to come in and to parade herself in front of the men, this war banquet, and kind of, to me, it would be kind of like patriotism, like the Queen of England, to come in and give men encouragement. But she denies him. And so he takes it personal, because he's thinking to himself, now wait a minute, if I can't get my own queen to obey me, how am I going to get men to go into war with me and obey me? And so, and all the other men, now remember, in chapter 1, you had they named the names of the 7 eunuchs that went to get Vashti. And then they literally named the names of the 7 advisors to Xerxes. And the advisors said, well, wait a minute, she has way too much influence with the women in your kingdom. So, matter of fact, if you don't do anything to Vashti, it's going to give all the women this encouragement to go against their husbands. They're afraid of their own anxieties, their own fears. And they were putting it on the kingdom. And so they said, dispose her, and we'll get other virgins to come before you. You can pick another queen. Well now, so Xerxes, between chapter 1 and chapter 2, he goes to war against Greece. And the movie 300 is based on this. And I happened to look up 300, the movie, and I wrote down the capsule of what the movie's about. And this is what it says. Sparta's King Leonidas and his badly outnumbered warriors fight to the death against King Xerxes' massive Persian army at the Battle of Thermopylae. And so you have Xerxes, he goes out to war again with Greece and he gets humiliated. He can't overcome, there's about 11 or 1,200 soldiers, about 3 different nations. He can't overcome them. And he's humiliated. And he comes back and his treasures are depleted. His name is, nobody believes him anymore. And what does he do? He gets new advisors. Remember, the 7 advisors and the 7 eunuchs, name by name in chapter 1, you don't hear about them anymore. And that's the way the world is, beloved. Once the world is done with you, once the world gives you bad advice, and once the world does something that you don't like, they get rid of you. The world just gets done with you and spits you back out. So he gets other advisors. He gets other people that would tell him what he wants to hear. He should have humbled himself, realized that God, the God of the Hebrews, is in in control of this humiliating defeat that he experienced, and I need to change my lifestyle. I need to worship the true God, but he doesn't. And because it says right in chapter 2, he remembers, yeah, I'm going to get all these virgins so I can pick one. They're going to experience 12 months of all this indulgence. Xerxes, instead of humbling himself, goes headstrong into his indulgence, into his sin. And this is what happens, beloved. For believers and non-believers, we will go through hard circumstances in life. And as a believer, you will see God's hand in it. And you will repent, and you will come out even more like Jesus Christ. Humbling. And what is Jesus doing? We read this the other week, John 17. He's taking his people. He's jealous of each one of you. And he's taking you and weaning you from the world. It's those times when you indulge all your sinful desires, all your sinful whims, that you're in trouble. It's not a blessing, that's a curse. And Xerxes just goes headlong. He doesn't take the warning, and he indulges. You know what happens to him? In 465 BC, he's assassinated in his own bedroom by some of his commanders because he was sleeping with their wives. This is what happens with Xerxes. So now we have Esther. Now Esther is Jewish. She does two things here. Mordecai tells her, hide your nationality. Don't tell anybody in the harem or in the king's palace that you're Jewish. And then he also, she marries a Gentile king, right? And when you look at that, it's easy to look at other people's decisions, the decisions that Mordecai and Esther have made, and size them up and think to yourself that you know what's right from wrong, and that if we were in their shoes, we would have made a different decision. We do that. Esther, because remember, Esther's a Jewish woman, and she marries a Gentile king during the time that Ezra was warning of the danger of mixed marriages concerning the people of Israel. So it's easy to talk about ethical and moral issues in the abstract, okay? Because many times, through hindsight, and we're all guilty of this, we can look back and analyze the situation and make a different choice. Well, I would have made this choice when you look back at hindsight. But while we're seeking God and his wisdom, and the situation continues to develop itself, ready or not, you're going to have to make that decision, like Mordecai and Esther. You're going to have to make that decision on what you believe the Lord's telling you to do. And it's during these times that you have to make that hard decision that we don't want other people making simplistic moral judgments about us. This episode from Esther's life offers us great encouragement and comfort, because we find ourselves in those situations where we have to make a decision. It seems like it's mixed. Any decision we make, it's going to be mixed with right or wrong. You know what? Only the Lord knows our story from the beginning to end. And we're responsible to live faithfully obedient to him in every situation the best that we know how. And I think of Jeremiah 17, 9 and 10, where it says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the minds and give everybody according to their works. That's what it says. So don't ever make the mistake that I'm justifying the ends from the means. I'm not. Matter of fact, when you go through the Old Testament and you start with the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, that's what you call it. I can't think of the word. It would be like common law today. That's the law that there's no gray area. Thou shalt not do this. It's God's commandments. But then when you get through Exodus chapters 21 through 23, remember the Ten Commandments in chapter 20. 21 through 23 is case law. It's what they call caustic law in the Hebrew. But today it would be case law. In other words, every situation is different from another situation when you make your decision. And it will be like if you lived during World War II and you were hiding some Jewish people, and the Nazis came to the door and said, do you have Jewish people in here you're hiding? You have a choice to make at that moment. You don't want anybody making that simplistic moral judgment of what you should be doing. It's between you and the Lord at that moment. That's what you call case law. That's all I'm going to say. So even when we make the wrong decisions, God is so gracious and omnipotent that he's able to use that weak link in a chain of events and enable us to continue to fulfill his purpose. But look at verses 19 through 23. It says, when virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So I didn't mention this last week. I had it in my notes, but I didn't mention it last week. In 1904, and I think it was in Susa, I can't remember where, they discovered artifacts or written, I guess what they call a stele, written during this time. And it had Mordecai's name in there as one of the rulers sitting in the gate during Xerxes' time on king. Mordecai was a real person, and this really happened. But Mordecai, he's sitting in the king's gate because of Esther, and that's like, he's like in the administration, one of the heavies that advises the king. And he overhears two other people, were they eunuchs? I think they're eunuchs, plotting to assassinate the king. And so he overhears this, and he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and they write it in the Chronicles. This is very important in the whole story of Esther. And it says in the history of the Persians by Herodotus that the loyalty and acts of faithfulness just like this was rewarded immediately and generously by Persian kings. But Mordecai's reward was apparently overlooked. And you know what that tells me many times? But this is probably the linchpin of the whole story right here. So here's Mordecai. He's in the gate. He overhears this assassination plot, and he informs Esther, informs the king, and they write it down. But for some reason, providence of God, for some reason the king just forgets about it. They forget about it, and life goes on as normal. And what do you think Mordecai's thinking? Why haven't I been rewarded? I put my life on the line, and I haven't received my reward. Many times, our reward will not be given until we get to heaven. I'll say most of the time, majority of the time, our reward will not be given to us till we get to heaven. The Lord knows everything you do in his name, and it's recorded, and it will be duly recompensed the minute we get to heaven. Make no mistake about it. And you know what? I think about this, and I think to myself, because I think the majority of the time, our reward will not be given to us till we get to heaven. But I think, so why at times, when I think I've done something in the name of Christ, and I don't receive anything from him, why is that? Maybe the Lord's testing us. Maybe the Lord is asking, do you really trust that I'm aware of what you do in my name? Or do you really just want applause and people around you? I mean, think about that. It's that process when the Lord doesn't immediately give us what we want that the Holy Spirit's really revealing our motives. And God is never late in rewarding his faithful servants. Never. And timing is everything in providence, and you can use this for a perfect example. And we always have to remember, even though his hand is invisible, the Lord is still accomplishing his purposes in your life. Because look what's going to happen. We'll meet Haman in 2 weeks. But what's going to end up happening with Mordecai is he doesn't get any reward at all, any recompense for what he did. And Haman, the arch enemy of the Jews, who hate the Jews and want to genocide the Jewish people, he continues to get his reward. He moves up past Mordecai and into the sancted place right underneath Xerxes. And his motive is to kill the Jews. And what do you think Mordecai's thinking? Lord, where are you? But it's going to turn right back on his own head, and a night that the king can't sleep, and he asks the chronicles to be read to him so he can sleep. Like Debbie. And the king is, and the servants are reading the chronicles to the king, and he hears about Mordecai. He goes, I forgot to reward Mordecai. And Haman comes into the room at that moment, wanting to tell the king, I want to kill Mordecai and all the rest of the Jews. And the king says to Haman, what should I do somebody to reward that person? We're going to get to that, but I'm just telling you there was a reason why the king forgot to reward Mordecai. Now look at Esther. Okay, now Esther never denied her faith, but only concealed it. That's a big difference there. And she concealed it in order to avoid potential problems and the pressure that came from her own family, even more from the empire and from the government. So we can't make basic, simplistic judgment at Esther unless we were walking in their shoes at that time. But I have to ask, we have to ask this, is it really a big deal to hide our faith in order to get that job promotion or fit into a peer group? Hiding our faith may lead to advancement in the world, but what about our souls? You know, Esther was willing to be poked and prodded, fattened and fumigated, perfumed and prepared over a 12-month period in order for a one-night stand in a royal position in the world. There's a lot of people that do that today, beloved. There's no different than when people want to go through what they go through in order to have a potential career in Hollywood or to be a high flyer in the business world. They will sell out their soul in order just to have that pleasure in the world. Many are willing to endure anything to achieve money, achieve fame, to achieve power at the expense of their souls. Yet, how little are we willing to endure God's beauty treatments that prepare us for Christ? Beloved, when you're His and you go through hard circumstances, He loves you. That's why He's doing it. He's weaning you from the world, and He's making you more like Him. And that's the wisdom of the Father. That's the wisdom of the Father, and the wisdom of the Father includes hard circumstances in our lives because He wants us to die to self. And He's weaning us from the world for our good, and you know what else? For our eternal homecoming when we go to Him. That's what He's doing. So Xerxes is not a blessed person. Even though he can get anything he wants in the world, he doesn't. His heart is so hard. He should have humiliated himself, confessed his sin to God, but he was so hardened in his sin that he just kept on going headlong. You know what? God owns all of us. He owns our dreams. He owns our aspirations. He owns our careers. He owns our families. And He exercises complete sovereignty over our entire lives. Once again, this is easy to admit in the abstract, isn't it? But it becomes harder when our lives take us in different directions that we hope for or pray for. Why? When, you know what? When the Holy One brings trials into our lives and causes us to lose everything that the world considers precious, how do we respond to that? How do we respond to that? When He exercises His claims on our lives, He does so to bring us good. One of my favorite verses in Hebrews, I won't get graphic, but it says, those whom He chastises He loves, and those whom He does not chastise are not His. And I'll be polite, not say what the word is saying in the Greek. Beloved, If you're going through hard circumstances, he's weaning you from the world and he loves you, and that's why you're going through that. Jesus Christ is our bridegroom. I love saying this. And for the sake of his bride, for the sake of us, he took on a form without beauty. Remember the suffering servant in Isaiah 53? He was despised, he was rejected. He was even rejected by those who came to save. In contrast to Esther's 12-month beauty treatments, our divine Savior undertook a 33-year pilgrimage, stripped of his eternal glory. See, that's what Christ laid down as his glory. There was no comforting beds or fattening foods for him. No, remember, he said there's nowhere to lay his head and nothing to call his own. But his pain was a requirement for our beauty. That's the real beauty treatments that we go through. And this self-sacrifice that he did for us gives him the right to call us to follow him through the worst of trials. Whatever path he leads you down, you can be guaranteed that he's trodden that before. You know what? When you go through a big city, you know the highways go through those cities, but they always have a bypass. A lot of them have a bypass, and you can just avoid all the traffic. That's not going to happen at death, beloved. He's going to make us go through death. But guess what? When we go through that shadow of death, he's going to be right there with us. I watched on a Christian show a couple of days ago. He was a 50-year-old bank executive, got diagnosed with cancer. And he went and got chemo, and 6 months later, I think it was 9 months later, it was gone. And then 3 years later, he got cancer again. This time it was incurable. And the doctor told me he had 6 months to live. And so he retires from his job as bank executive, and he goes headlong into ministry. And he's been alive now for about 4 years. But he said, it was during the last 4 years I've never become closer to God than I am now. And he's opened doors for me to witness to people. I've witnessed to more people in the last 3 years than I did my whole 50 years of living. And you know what? I'm saying, if you're losing your eyesight, if you have suffered a stroke, if you have broken your hip, beloved, I'm convinced of this. You're experiencing the intimacy of God more than you ever have before. You may not realize it, but other people are watching and they recognize it. But you see, Christ has prepared a glorious banquet for our honor. Our honor. He's going to give us a crown of splendor to beautify us in front of everyone. And a place of honor by his side. There's going to be a day on Judgment Day. This is part of justification. There's going to be a day on Judgment Day. And he's going to say, this is Joe Paul, who was faithful to me. In front of the world, in front of the non-believers, where he throws them into hell. He's going to acknowledge your name in front of the world. And you know what else he's going to do? You're going to be above angels. You're going to be above angels. Angels were not made in God's image. You were. Angels don't have a Savior. You do. That's going to be one thing as we go through eternity. The angels are going to marvel because we're going to have that more intimate relationship than they ever did. Because Christ didn't die for them. He died for us. And yet, I'm talking about myself here, and yet our hearts are quick to grumble and complain about the course of providence that he's ordained for us. We're slow to meet with him each day and spend time in his presence. I've told you this before, but I think it's a good time to say it again. 15, 20 years ago, I don't know how long it's been a long time ago, I had an opportunity to commit fornication. Okay? And I remember thinking to myself, I said, I can go do this, have the pleasure the world offers. Do you know what that's going to do? There's nothing more I look forward to every morning than getting up and spending that quiet time with the Lord. And I remember thinking to myself, if I do this, who knows how long it's going to be until I have that joy again of waking up with the Lord with a clear conscience. And I didn't do it. Because it meant more to me to spend that quiet time with the Lord than to indulge in any type of sin the world has to offer. And we have to remember that. When our eyes are fixed on Jesus Christ, our bridegroom, we're going to see through the emptiness the world has to offer. Most of us like to think that through thoughtful planning and wise living, we can successfully direct the course of our lives. We do. I think everybody thinks that. While most of the time the life might cooperate with our plans, all of us can probably look back and see how circumstances beyond our control redirected our lives. Sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. But our sense of being in control is at times revealed by life circumstances to be an illusion. And it is an illusion. Now I just want to finish with this really fast. Esther suffered the humiliation of being taken into the king's harem. No one cared what her plans might have been to be a godly wife of the family. Mordecai suffered the humiliation of being deprived of his rightful reward after saving the king's life. And to add insult to injury, which we're going to see, Haman was gaining power that would eventually be turned against Mordecai and his people. But the example of Esther and Mordecai gives us reason to bear such situations with patience and grace. If you don't think the Lord is recognized, is giving you your rightful due at this moment when you've done something for him, understand that he's aware of it, and you will be recompensed in his timing. But because of Mordecai and Esther's forbearance, it led to a greater good when it was finally put right. And that's what we have to remember.